Okay, we ready to get started, everybody? So we have two great papers here by David Takamura and Owen Goldin, and they're going to deliver their papers for about 20 minutes each. And then I'll have some comments. It'll take 10 minutes maximum, and then we'll open it up for everybody else for questions, okay? So David, you want to go first?
Thank you, Taco. And I will actually be reading, and what I will be reading is a cut version of the original, but I'll try to, I don't know if I can quite live up to the example of the previous presentation, keeping things down to 10 minutes, but I also would like to leave lots of time for Dan's comment and discussion. The cluster of philosophical approaches grouped together as transhumanist argues for the use of technologies to transform human nature into something different and better. Transhumanists have advocated the development and application of technologies that would integrate human cognition with cybernetics, allow for indefinite life extension, and allow the altering of the human genome in various ways. Although there is a libertarian streak to the transhumanist movement, transhumanists do more than argue against restriction from following such a path. They advocate it as a good thing. What good means here is, of course, an issue. Many within the Western tradition, as well as others, have based an account of the good on nature or the natural. So on this kind of an account, to impede or violate the nature is an evil. On such an account, transhumanism, which advocates not the development of human nature, but its negation in favor of something that's supposed to be better, is necessarily morally impermissible. But if you reject a teleological metaphysics that posits purposes in nature, then you also have to reject this kind of ethical theory. And the good has to be something else, whether it's rationality as in Kantianism or pleasure as in utilitarianism and so forth. So those who are opposed to taking steps in the transhumanist direction have been labeled as bioconservatives. I guess I'm a kind of a bioconservative. And there's, of course, a whole range of positions on this side of the spectrum, just as there's a whole range of positions on the side of transhumanism. So my concern today is not to stake out a position, how far do we go and how far should we not go? I'm rather concerned with a more foundational matter. Does an appeal to nature or the natural in opposition to transhumanism make any philosophical sense at all? And if so, how? And so the main challenge is, of course, going to be the challenge that any kind of moral naturalism faces. Do we have a concept of nature that has a way of bridging the so-called is-ought problem? Do contemporary scientific accounts of nature that are going to be metaphysically respectable, are they able to give ethical direction? And of course, the biggest issue here is going to be epistemological. That's why Descartes got rid of final causation in the sciences in the first place. He says, well, how am I supposed to know what God has in mind? So let's just give that up when we're doing science. I'd like to chat a little bit about other reasons why biology today makes it philosophically problematic to posit an ethical obligation to be protective of the human essence. From both a diachronic and a synchronic perspective, populations exhibit continuity in regard to genetic makeup. The lines by which we distinguish one species from another are by and large drawn on the basis of pragmatic considerations. So why is our way of classifying living things and classifying the human, distinguishing it from the non-human, going to be any different from what some transhuman intelligence in the future will understand as the kind to which such beings belong? There are going to be three figures with which I'm engaging here. One of them is Hans Jonas, the second being a follower of Hans Jonas, Leon Kass, and the third being Martha Nussbaum. I think that I can put them in dialogue with one another, and that's what I'm going to be trying to do here. So I'll begin with Jonas. At the time he wrote his last book, The Imperative of Responsibility, the term transhumanism was not yet in common currency. But the prospect of it was clear enough, foretold by Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And it was heralded by emerging technologies of assisted reproduction and life extension, and pointed to by advances in neuroscience and computer engineering. The main thesis of Jonas's book is that once a natural kind is recognized, and we appreciate that these beings are oriented towards both their own future and future existence of beings of the same kind, an ethical demand immediately presents itself without argument. And Jonas, being a phenomenologist, will point to our own experience to show that there is such a demand. He points to the helpless infant that calls out for us as demanding our attention and care, that he or she live into the future. And Jonas believes that considering humanity itself also calls out for us that human beings continue to be recognizably human beings into the indefinite future. So that's going to be not only the demand for nuclear non-proliferation or abandoning nuclear weapons, it's going to include addressing ecological crises, and it's going to include stopping the development of technologies like cloning, where future human life won't be recognizably human life. So Jonas recognizes that the imperative to preserve humanity as such into the future requires philosophical justification, which he provides in two mutually supporting ways. First, he accepts Heidegger's phenomenological account of human life as self-assertion in the face of an hostile external world, but he thinks that to understand humanity alone in that way is solipsistic and unjustified. Even the amoeba is asserting its own being against a hostile world. And biochemistry teaches us that there's a continuum between the living and the non-living, and between the cognitive and the non-cognitive. In acknowledgement of this, Jonas takes self-assertion to be characteristic of all reality, not simply that of animals or other living beings. And as our own Bob Neville has pointed out, there's a clear influence of Whitehead on Jonas on this point. At higher levels of material organization, one finds more complex ways in which physical things manifest this sort of expression of goal-directed impulses. Kinds are constituted by the kinds of expressions that typify them. So what is Jonas's strategy for determining what is human and what is not human? Because obviously we don't want to say that vaccines are an abandoning of human nature. We don't want to say the prosthetic limbs are an abandoning of human nature. So where do you draw the line? His strategy he calls the heuristics of fear. And basically it amounts to imagining a future. Science fiction and literature can be very, very helpful here. And if we have the emotional response that many of us have in reading Brave New World, where we are afraid of such a future and we shrink back from it emotionally, for Jonas, this is a real good indication that this is not a direction we want to go. So he's not basing the analysis of what's human or not by looking at the human genome. He's responding to fundamental emotional reactions. And Jonas tried very, very hard to slow down the process of human cloning. It didn't go anywhere, but his voice was not unheard. And the main follower of Jonas in this regard was Leon Kass, who, as many of you will remember, was the honcho of the first George Bush's I think it was the first one. He started the Ethics Council of Bioethics Council that Obama later dissolved. And Cass argued for a bioconservative position that should, and he argued for the cessation of human cloning. He was unsuccessful in that regard. There is no legislation there. Now, what Cass does is slightly different from what Jonas does, and has gotten him into a lot of hot water, because for him, the key emotion is not so much fear as repugnance. He coined the phrase, the wisdom of repugnance. And notoriously, he used this to argue for a very conservative sexual morality. That is to say, if we imagine certain kinds of human behavior and people recoil from it emotionally, then that's a good sign that this is violating human nature. And one of the most powerful critics of Cass in this regard was his colleague at the University of Chicago, Martha Nussbaum, whose work on emotions traced emotion as having evolutionary value in keeping humans from rotting meat and other kinds of biologically dangerous materials. She argued that repugnance has absolutely no role to play in an epistemology of ethics, because it basically reinforces people's biases and hatreds, and that human progress requires getting beyond this. So I think her criticisms are good ones. And Lawrence Vogel has a very good paper where he is very sympathetic to what Jonas is doing, but is very unsympathetic to the direction that Cass took things in regard to using emotions as a foundation for our evaluation of people's personal behavior. So if we get rid of emotions then as a way of deciding what is human and what is transhuman, if I can no longer say that I don't want the development of, say, the Star Trek Borg as a possibility for my descendants, but I can't simply use my emotional response there to say why this would not be a good idea for a very efficient and powerful society, then what's left? So I actually suggest that it is Cass's most effective critic, Nussbaum herself, that shows the way here. Nussbaum is actually on board with Jonas and Cass in taking emotions that have epistemological value. She's argued extensively that our emotions have cognitive content and constitute a kind of embodied thinking that's valuable to us, as valuable as other modes of thought. The problem with revulsion is not that it's an emotion, but because it has its root in the evolution of keeping ourselves from danger, from contaminated, icky stuff, that it is particularly suspect when dealing with outsiders and those who don't fit certain cultural norms. So how can we use our emotions as a tool in rationally determining what lives are worthy of humans? In a number of writings, she develops what is called the capabilities approach, and which I'm sure most of you have heard of. The idea is this, that the injustice of society is a matter of the extent to which it allows for and promotes the well-being of its members, where well-being is something like the Aristotelian eudaimonia. And what's eudaimonia? The exercise of fundamental capabilities, such as those of healthy living, affiliation, thought, and so forth. So this allows for a wide variety of forms of flourishing. There's not a one-size-fits-all of what eudaimonia or human life is, but it avoids an anything-goes relativism. She argues that this doesn't need to rest on a thick metaphysics, that we can just see what kind of cultural universals are there around the world. In what are there universals for what all societies recognize as those capabilities whose exercise constitutes a decent human life. So there's a lot in common with what she and Jonas and Cass are doing. We basically imagine a mode of life. For example, if we imagine a mode of life in which people are enslaved, then we will recognize that's not a life that I would want to live. And all cultures seem to accept that, because all cultures take autonomy or something like it to be a capability whose exercise is going to be part of any life that we would like to call a worthy human life. So in that will keep the Borg away from us, right? And presumably that will keep neurodes from being implanted in our brains by beneficent programmers. It might keep cloning away, or maybe it won't. But we have to wonder, will the development of a technology impede the exercise of a capability? So there is a kind of a sense of a notion of human nature here that we get at through imagining various futures and having an emotional response to it. But it is open enough to avoid the kind of use of emotions to reinforce bias and oppression that Nussbaum sees as possible if we go things the direction of Cass. And so that's basically what I want to do in this paper, is to show that Cass's philosophical opponent, Nussbaum, is actually giving a way to continue Cass's and Jonas's program. Now, the big problem, of course, is that Nussbaum is developing her account of what's human nature and what's not by a synchronic survey of what all societies now take to be human. Of course, there's no way you can do that diachronically, right? I mean, people are getting so attached to their cell phones. We can all see a time in the future when we're not just dealing with Google Glasses, but everyone will have a chip in their head with their cell phone. Well, these things happen creep by creep, step by step by step. So the idea is that maybe 2 generations from now, the capabilities that people take to be fundamental and how they understand them might be very different from the capabilities as we understand them now. So do we want to build a firewall against that with a more metaphysically robust idea of human nature? Or are we okay with this possible shift and creep? And I end my paper with that question, and I have no answers. Thanks for the opportunity to share these thoughts.
Thanks for 2 very interesting and thought-provoking papers. I wonder if I could talk for about 10 minutes before we open it up for questions from the audience. I've titled my comments Between the Hegemony of the Past and the Hegemony of the Future. I think these 2 papers hang together really, really well. It's my pleasure to respond to 2 papers that function as bookends to present time. As the title of the present remarks indicates, these 2 papers alert us to the twin dangers of the hegemony of the past and the hegemony of the future, respectively. My purpose in this response is to advocate for a moderate stance between these 2 extremes. And I think the 2 authors agree with me here, but we'll see if that's the case. Takamura makes apparent how easy it is to be seduced by the past, in that even Karl Marx was somewhat attracted to the romantic template, which on my interpretation typically has the following features: alleged primal bliss, a fall away from this bliss, a contemporary crisis, a perceived need to return to the primal source, and the need for a hero to guide us in this return. It's not surprising that J.J. Winkelmann and Martin Heidegger were attracted to this template, but the fact that it had a certain very limited attraction to Marx might come as a surprise. Of course, Marx ultimately resisted the romantic temptation in his rejection of the bourgeois sins of tradition. Retrospection, he thinks, is unproductive and easily leads to a fetishizing of the past. In this regard, Takamura rightly notes that ancient Greece acted as something of a tyrant over 19th century German thought. Even Marx himself wrote his dissertation on ancient Greek thought, specifically on those ancient Greek thinkers who came closest to materialism and atheism, the atomists. It is perhaps ironic that Marx experienced artistic pleasure from ancient Greek art, and that such art acted as a norm for Marx, but as a norm that was an unattainable ideal. One might refer even to the eternal charm of the Greeks, which cannot disappear even under capitalism. Marx was obviously opposed to any really energetic sentimentality, so the attraction of the Greeks to him was ultimately based on something other than sentiment. Rather, the attraction was due to the close proximity between the Greeks and nature, or physis. Even social relations, nomos, were somehow rooted in physis. From the Greeks, Marx seemed to have learned that there is a human nature. Hence, the Greeks offered to him a sense of normative humanity, despite the obvious historicist tendencies in Marx and the equally clear historical limitations of the Greeks in their role as the childhood of the human species. That is, a fascination for the Greeks need not be at odds with historical materialism, in that spectators with one economic base can enjoy the art from another base. Marx is not a romantic. Greek social relations built on slavery and other types of natural hierarchy will not return, nor should they. It is not insignificant for Takamura to note that the Greeks themselves did not idolize their own works. They are charming now precisely because they cannot return, even if there is an occasional romantic light pull on Marx due to a sense of lost freedom. Marx avoids the hegemony of the past, fostered by Romanticism, by seeming to defend only a partial reclamation of lost freedom by appealing to the Greeks so as to partially lift the modern burden of commodification. Goldin confronts a danger at the other extreme. The transhuman drive to transform human beings into something supposedly better also presupposes, as in Marx, that human nature is not a constant. But there is a much more forceful sense in the transhumanists that there really is no human nature at all. In a secularized version of the creation myth, the transhumanist hope for the future is that we will actually combat nature in the tradition of John Stuart Mill. This combat is a peculiar mix of utilitarianism and libertarianism that preserves only a thread of continuity with the past, on the analogy of the resemblance we have to our own remote biological predecessors. By contrast with the transhumanists, Goldin himself defends a broadly Aristotelian metaphysics of nature, which, in contrast to the transhumanists' futurism, makes Goldin something of a bioconservative. This puts him understandably in alliance with Hans Jonas and Leon Kass, but not so understandably in opposition to Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen. Like Jonas, Goldin is driven by a heuristics of fear. Although we are not repulsed by a human being with an artificial heart, we are fearful of a future human being with a brain connected to other brains via Wi-Fi. Like Cass, Goldin is skittish about a shift in medicine from a focus on healing to a focus on manufacture. I think that Goldin's primary thesis, as I interpret him, that a transhumanist future raises legitimate fears of dystopia, is more important than his internecine dispute with Nussbaum and Sen, which it doesn't seem like as much of a dispute when I hear Goldin speak here orally. It did when I read the paper initially. All three thinkers agree that there are certain Aristotle-inspired human capabilities, nutritive, sentient, and rational, which, if not met, leave people in a less than fully human condition. I suppose that Nussbaum's distancing herself from bioconservatism is primarily due to a fear that such a view could be hijacked by those, like Cass, who have conservative views regarding various topics in sexual ethics. If Nussbaum's fear is well-founded, then it would make sense for her and for Goldin to try to isolate essential human nature without the culturally bothersome parts. My suspicion is that Nussbaum is more like bioconservatives like Goldin than she realizes, and that Goldin's view is very much like Nussbaum's and Sen's capabilities approaches. All three parties, I think, should welcome the effort to think through carefully which sorts of discuss are merely cultural and which are, for lack of a better word, evolutionary. Although Takamura's and Goldin's papers might initially appear to be quite different, I think that by putting them together, we can see the outlines of a defensible view of time as processual and asymmetrical. In this view, the relationship between the present and the past is radically different from the relationship between the present and the future. The past has already occurred and will not literally return. Even if patterns exhibited in the past might recur, the actual events that have occurred cannot, in their particularity, ever be repeated. This is why Marx could never be a romantic thinker. As Alfred North Whitehead put the point analogously, strict conservatism is the universe, in that at each moment a partially new reality comes into existence. Nature is ever new. The proximity to physis that made the ancient Greeks somewhat attractive to Marx begins to look more processual than it might initially seem if, as Whitehead alleges, the word physis should be translated into contemporary English as creativity rather than as nature. Nature changes in each momentary experience of it and in it. There is, contra Hume, a causal influence of the past on the present, but the causality in question consists in necessary but not sufficient conditions exerted on the way present decision-making confronts future determinables and renders them determinate. That is, the fleeting present is the region where determinables are made determinate. Although in some interpretations, Marx is seen as a determinist who thought that the future course of events was already in the cards as a result of the power of the past. This is not the only possible interpretation of Marx's thought, nor the most defensible interpretation, given Marx's lifelong efforts to deliberately change the way we think about and act in the social world around us. His entire intellectual project seems to presuppose human agency in the midst of the causal inheritance we receive from the past. There's also a role for the future to play in our present decision-making, in that the future is the region of the possible. The future is the region of what might be, or at most, what will probably be, if the causal inheritance from the past is especially heavy. Strict determination by the future can occur, it seems, only if one subscribes to a version of classical theism of the Leibnizian variety. For example, if God is omniscient in the sense that God already knows the details of what will definitely occur in the future and has such knowledge infallibly, then it makes sense to say that the future is in a way already in the cards and cannot be altered. I take it that the transhumanists do not subscribe to this sort of determinism, but they might hold a related view wherein the goal of science is to eventually have scientists acquire the sort of knowledge traditionally alleged to be divine, including absolutely certain knowledge in minute detail of all that will happen in the future. If this were the case, there would really not be any future contingencies, only the performance of what was already necessitated in the divine or truly scientific mind. In any event, the transhumanists have a distorted concept of the future if it involves a carte blanche to do whatever it is technologically possible to do. Both domination by physis and the desire to escape altogether from it seem extreme. So if there's a thesis to my comments, it's that sentence. So let me read it again. Both domination by physis and the desire to escape altogether from it seem extreme. In this regard, it strikes me that both Takamura and Goldin are commendably moderate. A paraphrase from Josiah Royce from The Philosophy of Loyalty might help in the effort to bring together the collective wisdom found in Takamura's and Goldin's papers. Or at least this paraphrase of Royce might function well to initiate our discussion of these two fine papers. So this is my paraphrase of Royce. Whenever we most carefully revise our metaphysical, moral, aesthetic standards, we are able to see that we are finding out in some new light the true meaning that was latent in old traditions. Revision does not mean mere destruction. We should, in fact, bury what is dead in traditions, but we should also nourish what is still living in them as part of the communal effort to more closely approximate both the truth and a just society. This effort involves an attraction to a lure from the future with a lowercase t teleology, if not teleology with a capital T. One is also reminded of the famous remark from Isaac Newton to the general effect that if he was able to see further in the future than others, it was due to the fact that he stood on the shoulders of giants from the past. In any event, I would like to thank Professors Takamura and Goldin for their very clear and insightful contributions.
Thank you. Thank you for the generous remarks.
Sure. So we have it's a small enough Zoom screen here that if you just raise your hand like this, if you have a question, I can acknowledge you. Is Matthew Childers, do you have a question? If not Matthew, how about Vince? I see your hand, Vince.
Thank you, Commentator and Papers. I wonder about several small words that might bear large significance. What in regard to David's paper, if we thought of the transhistorical rather than the ahistoric, and we thought of the transhistoric in terms of an indefinite, not necessarily a timeless duration. So the question for me is, how can a historicist maintain, if indeed a historicist can, any notion of classic? This marks the second question, the one you addressed. It seems to me that there's a way of doing that, but we have to get rid of the eternal or the ahistoric, and we have to talk about that which cuts across time frames indefinitely, but not necessarily infinitely. So I wonder if that is I suggest that as a friendly amendment. And to Owen, I wonder if, you know this stuff better than I do, but do we need to define the transhuman in terms of the negation or merely of the human, or merely the transcendence and the transfiguration for the sake of overcoming some of these destructive anthropocentric tendencies? And that will necessarily involve the negation of some facets of the human, but that puts the emphasis on the destructive rather than the transformative and the transfigurative. So that's my intervention, but thank you for both and the commentary too. Thanks.
David, do you want to go first and then Owen?
I would just, but that sort of wins by definition. I would say in a more Gadameryan mode, the essence of hermeneutics is to let something which spoke before speak again, and speak in a way that's audible at this time and in this place. And how is that possible? It seems to me it is possible. And then we have to do justice to that experience. So I would not go in the direction of Benjamin. I would much rather, although there's much there, I'd much rather go in the direction of Gadamer.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Vince, for your really, really interesting question. If we're going to be understanding the use of technology as not negating the human, but as moving beyond human limitations, we need some idea of what is the good and that we're aiming at. And most of the transhumanists are more or less utilitarians, which is to say that whatever people want, we can use technology to get it. But as I understand it, you're suggesting that transhumanism could be in the service of a more generous and moral vision, perhaps using technology to get rid of the kinds of aggression and acquisitiveness that has been a problem for human beings, or maybe simply to allow for a kind of a freedom where freedom is the good. So I guess this brings us to the whole question of what the good is. So if you're more or less of an Aristotelian eudaimonist like me, then it's going to be human nature as we have it that is going to determine what the human good is. And we need to be careful not to muck with human nature in a way that negates what is essential. Now, whether our aggressive or possessive tendencies are fundamental to human flourishing or the exercise of our capabilities, I don't know. And then, of course, there's always the moral of every science fiction story that when you start mucking with things, then you have all kinds of unintended consequences, whether it be Jurassic Park or the Frankenstein monster, right? So who is to say once you start changing the human brain to avoid the kinds of tendencies that lead to warfare and cruelty? So I would tend to be cautious in that regard, but I hear the force of your question, and I thank you for that.
Just quickly, I love your response, but human nature as we have it is actually to some degree historical and open-ended. And so from a purely Aristotelian perspective, we can underscore those facets without exaggerating them in the extreme.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, in the past, it has been human culture that has allowed for the emergence of human nature in ways that has not been foreseen in the past. And so, of course, that's a good Aristotelian point. Aristotle would recognize that culture has a very, very important role to play in habituating us, and in so doing, uses nature as a kind of a matter, but develops us to be good moral people. When you start mucking with the hule, when you actually start dealing with the genome or the structure of the brain, that's a different kind of thing. It's a different kind of change in human nature than what has ever been seen before. Except maybe at an evolutionary level, which is a very, very, very long-term kind of thing.
Michelle, I see your hand.
Hi. I just want to take up that last bit of discussion, if I may. Yeah. So this notion from Owen concerning Aristotle's sense of human nature, and in the description just given, I just wonder why we would accept why would we ignore the fact that Aristotle's logic of the syllogism affects how we regard what we regard intelligibility itself to be, in the sense that its evolution or its capacity for dynamism is limited in Aristotle's logic. So I don't really understand why we wouldn't challenge those things, that logic particularly. And I am thinking of Peirce's critique of Aristotle's logic specifically, and I'm thinking of that because I think any idea of what future humans may be first requires a notion or an explanatory thesis on how it is we think and how intelligibility becomes manifested by us in our agency to change our world. So I think that I would just really, I would love to see a corollary piece on that, engaging and on those very fundamental levels of how language is not merely linguistic. Language is a species of thinking, and thinking is determined by how we understand a much broader sense of intelligibility, which affects our view of scientific future potentials and all of that, and how we think of other species. You know, it's a very broad comment, but I just wanted to open it up a little bit.
Well, that's of course a very, very fair point. I mean, Aristotelian ethics tends to be rather conservative and tends to sometimes be rather conservative in ways that we would not want it to be. And so because you have, even if you don't fully know the essence from a scientific point of view, you at least think that there is such a thing, and that you're going to look around for the person of practical wisdom as being the model of this is what human nature actualized is. And such a person might be living a life that is limiting what it can be human. And you might look at the slaveholder or the patriarch as the model of the fulfillment of human nature. So that's a common criticism against Aristotelian eudaimonism. So the idea of culture as growing in dynamically in new and hopefully better ways is a wonderful model. The problem is that onward is not necessarily upward, and that's my and that would be my remark in regard to the way Dan was bringing in process philosophy here, is that if you understand the cosmos as necessarily engaging in greater and greater creativity, and that's always a good thing, then just why not, let's put the brakes off and see where that goes. But we have enough experience with technology to realize that there can be some kind of negative stuff that happens if you just let things go the way they will. So I guess we have to have some kind of reflective equilibrium here. And my use of the capabilities approach was an attempt to find a way of allowing for progress without at the same time letting anything go. But I appreciate your question.
Sure, thank you.
Jessica, and then Wes.
I'd like to go back to the point made before a minute ago in response to Vinny's question about the idea that somehow changing the structure of the brain is a change that is different in kind, as opposed to other kinds of changes to the body that might not be so considered. And also to bring this up in the context of thinking about unintended consequences. So to contextualize my question, I would say almost every change in human history has unintended consequences. So that can't be the litmus test, right, for what we ought not to do. It's certainly a good litmus test for, like, we shouldn't act rashly and just assume that every technological change is good, right? But everything has unintended consequences. So that concerns me. But the thing about the brain structure being different in kind, I just wonder what that line could be, given that we're already doing that, right? So the kinds of implants that can make deaf people hear and can influence blind people to have experiences that are apparently in some ways akin to sighted people. And they're doing things where people can move, computer mouses with their so-called thoughts. I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff that's already changing there. And I don't know what would make that different in kind. I can see why it would make people kind of go, hey, wait a minute, let's think about what this implies. But I'm not sure that it's different in kind. And I wonder if it's the same sort of emotional response, right, with all the problems that those have, as when people give stories of addiction now. You hear people say, like, oh, it's a disease, it has no free will. Don't you know addiction changes the brain? And anybody with any neuroscientific background has to come back and say, every freaking experience you've ever had has changed your brain. It changes your synaptic connections. It changes all kinds of things, right? So it can't just be that it changes the brain. Like, there's a sort of instinctive, like, not that one, any other organ, you can change my heart, my liver, but not that one. But so A, we already are. B, I don't think that it's got a hard and fast kind distinction. So that doesn't answer what we do about it, but I just wonder what you think about that, because the idea that that's the cutoff confuses me.
I don't think there's anything particularly cutoffish about the brain. I was trying to find an example of what would be beyond the pale. Obviously, a prosthetic limb is fine, but I could have just as well picked RoboCop or something like that. That there are going to be limits beyond which we're not dealing with people anymore. And so I was assuming that most of us take autonomy in some sense to be a fundamental capability that we wouldn't want to muck with. So, taking psychiatric medication seems to enhance autonomy. Having a lobotomy, on the other hand, though it might lead to a more pleasurable existence, would seem to negate autonomy. So we use these mental experiments to try to figure out where we draw the lines. I wouldn't say there's anything special about the brain, except that the brain does seem to be very tightly connected with a lot of these capabilities that I would say that we value as basic.
That's actually super. I think that point actually can help a lot because I think it points to an enduring value we have. But I also want to stress, and I think this is in line with Vinny's point, that there's a consequentialism that I actually heard in some of what you're saying that I think is important. And maybe it's not there and I'm just wishing it into what you're saying, which is, there's a point at which you can't just take an antecedent, say like, all right, this is human nature antecedently, and then forbid things in the future. There's an experimentalism. If we do this, will this become stuff that people experience as enhancing their autonomy, or will it change the way in which they value autonomy? Like, that sounds bad to me, that we would become beings that wouldn't value autonomy, but that's from my perspective, right? So there's a kind of consequentialism. Anyway, thank you. I appreciate that a lot.
David, do you want to respond to the comments from Michelle and Jessica before we move to Wes?
The quick comment on the brain thing. I mean, that's big chunk of difficult questions, but the key fire break for discussions of transhumanism isn't brain body, but the germline, given Weissman's sequester in biology. It's mucking with the germline because we just, I recommend, people like Lou Wanton, the so-called dialectical biologist, and others who are quite alert to the ways in which we may have a good sequence of the genome, but we really don't understand how it works, how it functions in context, including its own biological context. But anyway, that's a comment. My question is for Owen, and it's an interloper's question because I went to hear May's paper first and then joined you all late. In fact, I put on a clean shirt and shaved, so hope that matters to her. Anyway, but though I'm very sympathetic to Michelle's comment, I want to ask Owen, just strictly from an Aristotelian point of view, isn't it the case that we need to be alert to the distinction between the essence proper and propria? Because you made it, and all this rambling remark is dedicated to a comment you made in passing, something to the effect of, well, perhaps acquisitiveness and selfishness are part of our nature too. But that can't be right for Aristotle. They might be propria that we're stuck with, at least pending modification. But it seems to me they can't be part of the essence proper. So could you comment on that and whether that distinction might help at all in this discussion?
Well, of course, Aristotle never actually defines human being. We get something like his account of basic essences in human essence in Nicomachean Ethics, but there's just the ability to rationally choose. And Aristotle thinks, the virtuous agent will stick up for her guns and won't be a doormat, but at the same time will find the mean in regard to aggression and possession. And but he doesn't really work that through logically on the basis of some definition. He just looks at what Pericles or some honored individual would do and do what they would do. So I hear what you're saying, but the Aristotelian idea of an essence really needs to be dropped in light of what we now know about the evolution of the brain. There's lots of different stuff going on, pushing us in various directions. We've evolved both to care for fellow human beings, and we've also evolved to hate members of tribes who are different from us. And culture is working with channeling those in directions that are not going to be destructive to our lives and our well-being. So yeah, that's what's driving the transhumanist project on, is that we are a bundle of contradictory programs that don't always work out. We have wars and we have suffering and we have ecological devastation. So maybe we can give evolution a little bit of a push here and help us into the future. So that's the force of your question. I think that we do not have a unitary Aristotelian grasp of essence, and but nonetheless, that doesn't mean that we should just drop it all. And so it's a dialectical kind of thing that involves reflective equilibrium.
Yeah, I think it's a marvelous answer, and that you're now have been recorded going a little further than I've heard you go before, but it's wonderful to hear you say this. But what I was fishing for was just to try to parse from an Aristotelian point of view, or even an evolved Aristotelian point of view, towards keeping the essence as normative. I mean, you're right, Pericles, those examples. So one could be a kind of transhumanist and say that the sub-movements within transhumanism, which are looking to promote the good, are precisely not mucking with the human essence, but furthering the human essence, and maybe doing away with some of the propria that we've been stuck with as necessary part of baggage because of our evolutionary inheritance. But anyway, thank you, appreciate it.
You.
Any other questions? I had a question about cloning. How about, let me go to Richard. Richard.
Oh, well, this is actually a rather, maybe somewhat banal comment, but when you consider the Aristotelian approach, it's not to say that particular emotions or passions are inherently bad, but how they are developed in certain circumstances. And you have of course, the familiar theme of finding the mean. And the problem with the technological approach is you don't know whether a technological manipulation is going to be able to provide a crucial element of judgment and of finding means with respect to our emotions and passions. I mean, after all, aggression is connected to ambition, and it's the sort of thing people need if they're going to hone their skills as artists or as athletes or in most areas of life. And if you try to pinpoint the danger point of aggression and control that, well, the Clockwork Orange scenario. So, I mean, the subtlety of human judgment, something that's really difficult to translate into some sort of technological control or manipulation of the human, I would say, is just a general caveat about it. Does that make sense?
I agree 100%.
I think it's interesting in Aristotle too, the virtue of the ambition. The Greek word is philotomia, love of honor, but it's exactly the same word he uses for the vice by way of excess. So Aristotle was aware of the fact that this is a really slippery virtue because it can so easily slip into the vice by way of excess. Yeah. Owen,
could I ask a question of David in regard to his paper? You were talking about slavery in ancient Greece and the Aristotelian perspective. Yeah, that struck me as the question in working through your paper as well, because of course there does seem to be a class system in ancient Greece, and it seems to be very far from innocent. So I don't know Marx very well, but it was a little bit of a surprise to see Marx considering the ancient Greeks as innocent before class struggle developed. So a couple of ideas about that. If you just look at Aristotle's account of slavery, there's two kinds of slavery that he has in mind. One is the slavery of his time, which, as many people noticed, was not in accordance with his metaphysical politics. The slaves were just people that you grabbed off the battlefield and when you were looting the town, and so it had nothing to do with natural capacities. So Aristotle's own account is a criticism of that. And if you think about what natural slavery would be for Aristotle, well, that would be the tools acting willingly of themselves. There's no oppression there. We're not oppressing anybody's self-realization. Rather, the slavery, as he conceives it, would be the context in which the slaves would be realizing their capacities. So I was wondering if that might be a way of understanding the ancient Greek world as innocent in a Marxist context. There's no class struggle. There's one tribe beating up another tribe, or there is everybody freely actualizing who they are.
If you were a citizen and male and a property owner, there was a sort of freedom there. I'm trying to think out loud here why Marx may have had the admiration for the Greeks that he had. In other words, the way that people participated in political life in the polis could be appealing, right? If you abstracted away the fact that you had all these aliens and slaves and women and others who were not part of the political life, but for those who were part of the political life, it was active and energetic, and has given us some classics and Thucydides and Plato dialogues and so on. Am I on the right path to trying to figure out why Marx had the peculiar sort of admiration that he had for Greek freedom, David?
Mm-hmm. Just a quick remark. I'm sorry I had to miss your paper, David, unavoidably.
No problem.
I wondered if you had any thought about, Marx's relationship to Hegel, and or you could say Schiller, because both of them thought about the Greeks as having achieved, a completely unprecedented understanding of freedom. And, they may be exaggerating, but I mean, they're claiming that in the life of the polis, there was this discovery that human beings are free and that they have mutual recognition thereof, and that it's embodied in their laws. And so they're learning that political life can't be based on mere authority, mere positive authority. So, I mean, Hegel, of course, Marx was greatly influenced for a while, obviously, by Hegel. But it perhaps isn't really so puzzling that at least that he starts from that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Richard. In fact, I had my hand up to make a similar point. I think that's right. And also in terms of the structure of dialectic, anyway. I mean, for certainly for the Marx of the manuscripts and for Hegel, and mature Hegel, the first stage always presages the completion. In ways sometimes at the intermediate stages don't. The one other thing that I would add, and again, David, I'll download and read your paper. As I said earlier, I came late also. Mine was avoidable, but choice anyway. But that's that. Every stage has its positive contribution to make, every essential stage. Feudalism as well. The master-slave societies have a positive contribution to world history, and then they degenerate. The same thing with feudalism and capitalism as well, as progressive in the beginning, and now its time is spent. We need to move on. That's sort of that's a second consideration to bring in when one asks, why does he have nice things to say about feudalism or what have you? That always happens. So for both reasons, there's some rationale for positive remarks about the Greeks and others.
Yes.
I think we're about out of time, so I wonder if we could give a virtual applause to the two presenters who did great jobs. So.